equally so, Big Mama. Some of those who sold you out to the regime are here. Mama, some of those who sold out. And what is funny, Mama, is that they are crying the loudest, more than all of us who cared for you. Mama, the UDF cabal is here. The cabal that rejected you and disowned you and sent you to the brutal apartheid regime is here. When they called the press conference during the dark days of apartheid, when they called the press conference, when the regime was prepared to kill and said in that press conference, you are not part of them, they are here today. Mama, why did the UDF call a press conference to disassociate themselves from you? Because you were never a member of UDF. You were a member of the ANC. You were the only one who was pronouncing ANC in the 80s. Why did the UDF see the need to disassociate themselves with a person who was not their member? Mama, you never told me how we must treat them when they come here. I'm waiting for a signal, man. Mama, Nomzamo, all those who resigned from the NEC of the Women's League because they said they cannot be led by a criminal, they are here. Some of them are playing prominent roles in your funeral. In a funeral of a person they called a criminal. In a funeral of a person they were ready to humiliate in front of the whole world. They are here, Ma, I'm waiting for a signal on how we should treat them. Mama, the same people who
Just an excerpt of the powerful speech given by Julius Malema at the Winnie Mandela funeral in 2018 in South Africa. Welcome everyone to another edition of the Truth Gangsters podcast. Tonight we celebrate our mother, Nomzamo Winnie Madikizela Mandela, mother of South Africa. You know, there is an interview that Winnie gave, I believe it was in the 1980s, of the apartheid struggle. And during that interview, she recounts a conversation that she had with one of her daughters, Zinzi, about why her father, Nelson Mandela, was in prison. Her daughter, Zinzi, observed that the neighbor's father was not in prison and proceeded to ask her mother a poignant question. If all fathers and all South African men are opposed to the apartheid regime and the oppression that exists thereunder, then why is my father in prison and that man isn't? Why aren't all fathers in prison, mommy? And it's very clear that this story draws into stark realization the effect of the apartheid regime on the South African psyche, in that it tended to produce two extreme personalities: the fighter on the one hand, and what some may call the conquered on the other. Winnie Mandela emerged as the former, hardened during the years in prison, the years in isolation, the years in exile, the years in solitary confinement, after which she emerged as a soldier, a woman of indomitable spirit and incomparable courage. She indeed carved out an identity of her own. And this is important to mention because oftentimes when we look at the lives of revolutionaries who were married to revolutionaries, especially women, that is, we tend to look at it through the lens of the old adage: behind every great man stands a great woman. Winnie did not stand behind Nelson. She was a warrior in her own right. The extreme violence, the oppression, it made Winnie what she was. And in fact, if you look at the brevity of their marriage, I believe they got married in 1958. Nellie went away in 1962. Those facts and even her own words makes it clear that she didn't have time to be molded, so to speak, by her husband. She developed this fighting spirit on her own path. And despite being betrayed by some, forgotten by many, minimized by even more, and slandered by even more still, she remains the mother of the nation, the mother of South Africa, a woman who is from a bloodline of warriors and fighters. Many of you may not know that Winnie's great grandfather, Madikizela, was the second in command to the great Shaka Zulu. So tonight we wish to explore her life, her humanity, her beauty, her strength, her loyalty to her people, and uncompromising warrior who exemplified African strength and loyalty. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. I look forward to tonight's discussion. And I want to start out by looking at Nelson Mandela and the way in which many compare them. And I want to hear your thoughts on this. Um, Winnie was effectively a single mother who did not shy away from the fight of her people. And of course, we know Nelson Mandela's early years leading the ANC as an attorney, as a fighter. He too was very revolutionary, and he too fought valiantly against the apartheid regime. But there's a South African based lawyer who makes an interesting commentary. He says, in describing Winnie, Winnie effectively, I'm quoting him now, a widow and a single mother, but stood like a colossus, staring down the barrel of apartheid guns, while others were in jail or fought the fight from the safe capitals of foreign countries. She was the difference between the ground troops in the line of fire and the generals in their safe bunkers. Far from the madding crowd, she led from the front. And for many black South Africans, when all seemed lost and impossible, she stood out as the only beacon of hope. Leighton, brother Leighton, welcome. Is it fair to say that husband Nelly fought the safer battle behind bars in 27 years, for 27 years, while his wife was on the front line? Or is that an unfair and unnecessary comparison?
Uh, uh, what a loaded question. A great intro, by the way, and I love that Malema speech. If you're in prison, you're in prison. What are you gonna do about it? Except uh, try to inspire from in prison, uh, communicate your ideas and hope, even when there appears to be none. And it seems like up until his uh, ultimate capitulation, Nelson fought a good fight. Um, the fact that Winnie, was free, quote unquote, during this time is there's really no comparison. She was uh, had it harder, and from a reasonable perspective that looks at how often she was in and out of prison, how often under house arrest, how badly she was her children were targeted by the apartheid regime, and the fact that she was a young mother. People tend not to realize the age gap between herself and Nelson. He was there was some 30 odd years between
He
them.
was almost 48 when she was, what, 21 or 22?
22 indeed. So so you're talking about a young woman, two young children, and targeted like solitary confinement, 6 months, 7 days straight interrogations, sickness, and being brought in, taken into custody, taken into detention, right upon being diagnosed with a heart condition. So you're talking about somebody who was subject to physical, emotional, psychological, mental torture, extreme torture, and who not only did not break, but provided incomparable leadership and with grace under that amount of pressure. A really phenomenal woman.
I only make the suggestion, um, not to compare them in light of their work necessarily. Certainly not at this stage. Perhaps later on we can discuss. Simply because the media, the historians do compare them. And whereas we are constantly reminded about the work of Nelson, constantly bombarded with his image. He was so great. He was the long walk to freedom. I don't find that the same flowers, quote unquote, are given to Mama Winnie. And I'm just wondering, if you're in prison and I'm on the battlefield. By the way, it wasn't 6 months in solitary solitary confinement. It was 16 months, over a year. I often wonder why we don't give enough credit to the fighter who was on the ground. Also because of the criticisms that have been levied against her. It's easy to criticize someone who is on the battlefield making ready decisions. Some say that she was cruel, some say that she was violent. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, indeed. And uh, from that perspective, you are you're certainly right. Um, not nearly enough attention. In fact, no attention is given to her work on the ground, her work in keeping the movement alive. As she mentioned in an interview, he was the ANC and she became the ANC. And I think so much of the narrative of his imprisonment centers on the efforts to keep his name alive in other capitals of the world and to bring external pressure to bear on the apartheid regime. And almost none is given to Winnie's leadership, except, as you rightly mentioned, to critique her like she was too much of a firebrand and too uh, violent in dealing with informers and reactionaries. So I completely agree with you. Yes, it's her leadership contribution on the battlefield totally overlooked or calumniated.
Thank you. I see my good friend Ashley has joined the conversation. Ashley often reminds me of a quote. I don't recall who said it. He can probably tell me. It might have been a journalist. But the person said, imagine Nelson Mandela forgave the apartheid regime. He forgave the white man, but he couldn't forgive Winnie Mandela. How fair is that?
Completely. I can't, there's no gainsaying it.
Ashley, you've joined us. You wish to clarify that quote? I hope I did not misquote you or misquote your story. Please, what are your thoughts on the topic?
Oh, good night, everybody. Good night, host. No, you didn't misquote the quote. I just can't recall right now who said it. And it was controversial. The yeah, Kish, that was an excellent opening. It's like a mini historical retrospective. One of the most important, personally, points in my recollection of Winnie Mandela is actually after she's passed. I remember the way in which the media especially hounded her during the latter part of her life. And the funeral was something that I said to myself that I had to watch. Now, Joseph Malema addressed the funeral, and another figure who have a difficult and complicated relationship with. But I would encourage everybody to go and look at that address if YouTube hasn't taken it down, because Malema was vehement in his defense of her contribution to the struggle. And at a certain point in his reflection, he stopped and he said, "Look at all of you in this audience. Many of you are betrayers. Many of you are conspirators, right? Many of you hid during the struggle and came after to take praise for the work that many of the revolutionary heroes, including Winnie, suffered for, right? Um, and one of the things that has always struck me is that people phrase it in some of the same terms of saying why we don't give credit. And I'm always reminding them that after apartheid fell, Nelson was raised to almost the status of a demigod, right? And so the implications of what he did for the struggle in terms of whether or not his action was a sellout or a capitulation, the media that was supporting apartheid did not want to open that door. And so if it is that there is a whitewashing, which I think to a certain extent that has happened to Mandela and his legacy, um, and an ignoring of the other parts of his legacy that was more aggressive towards apartheid, especially during the younger days, then the heroes like Winnie will never get a fair hearing or a fair showing from the interests that were supportive of the regime, and only right before it fell turned and spoke out of the other corner of their mouths, like the serpents they are, to say what a great thing Nelson did. So, in the recount of the history, you must always be aware of who is telling the history and why is it that they're saying what they're saying. I'll stop there for now, Keish.
Thank you, thank you, Ashley. That's very important. Um, it's an angle that I hadn't really explored properly before, but you are certainly correct. Even in the ways in which I disagreed or disagree with some of Mandela's policies, I can't deny that his legacy has been whitewashed. And we have to consider, too, that part of the telling of the history is to create an exaggerated feud between himself and Winnie. I mean, we know the history. We know that he fired her from her post in the ANC once he became president. And it's hard. I must tell you, it's hard for me to reconcile some of his actions toward her. But I am guided by your reminder that so much of how we are brought to view the history is tainted by our enemies. Leighton, what's your view on that?
I think that the ideological divide between Nelson and Winnie uh, obviously couldn't be bridged. She obviously wanted to fight to the end and did not want to accommodate uh, the white people as Nelson did. Once that, once the narrative went Nelson's way and South Africa became this wonderful melting pot and with this most progressive constitution ever, truth and reconciliation, kumbaya. then those who still wanted to fight, those who were still looking at the 90% of farmland owned by whites and blacks still shunted, Africans still shunted onto the worst land. Um, those people kind of were shunted to the background, and so that's where Winnie was. I saw several commentaries at the time that said that Nelson's difficulty with her was not personal but political, that he had to distance himself from her in order to carry through a reconciliation program when his wife was a firebrand, obviously hostile to reconciliation. So, in the political exigencies of the time, it was imperative, as that narrative goes, for him to put her away.
Sounds like Nelson Mandela was the ultimate traitor. I mean, I'm open to hearing dissenting views, but again, it's hard not to view him that way in light of Winnie's struggle. Leighton, sorry, you were saying something?
Yes, I have. I remember when the whole dismantling of apartheid, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Joint Peace Prize with Mandela and what was the guy's
Is
name?
it
De Klerk?
the clerk? FW de Klerk?
Yes,
Yes,
the clerk. Mm-hmm.
yes. And I something bothered me about it. And what bothered me was, why were they doing it? Why were white people willing to have a black majority government after all that they had been through? Because they were still doing well. Sanctions or what? Like, what was it? And I always got the sense that there was a cauldron in that society that they knew would bubble over, that they felt the only way that they could prevent was to release Mandela on the condition that he quell those fires, that he came with some peace and forgiveness and let bygones be bygones and move forward in racial harmony, you know, thing, and so that they could keep the lid on it. And it just never sat well with me. And it's interesting that Malema's organization, because eventually when the ANC sold out and the sellout became deeper, as he saw it with the post Mandela people, Tabo, I forget his name, and Zuma, and them.
And Mbeki.
So, yes, Mbeki and Zuma. So, listen to what he called his party, the Economic Freedom Fighters. And twice in the funeral address, he talks about the economic rectification within our lifetime. Within our lifetime. So he's not about this, well, in the by and by and things will trickle out. He wants it now. And that I think it's a reaction to what he saw really as Nelson's sellout.
You know, when you hear commentary about Winnie Mandela's approach to liberation in South Africa, many say that her approach was not sustainable. It's not tenable to keep fighting. You know, revolution and war is bloody. We know about the Stumpy trial and all the other allegations of the people who were necklaced, quote unquote, and you know the fact that she was involved in a lot of controversy surrounding killings of people that she identified as her as traitors. And many people say, look, this is just not sustainable. This woman is a she's going to lead the country into ultimate ruin. And for the sake of peace and for the sake of keeping lives whole, we had to have an institution like Nelson Mandela, calling him an institution, that represented the Rainbow Nation. How fair is that, Ashley?
Is a hard one, Keisha. Um, the thing about it, politicians, and it's is weird because I have to I have a job where I have to engage with them on a certain level, and I remember this comic once said that politics is like show business for ugly people, and they they are very imperfect people, but among them are people of strong convictions. Whether you believe in what they are saying or not, or other people that have those convictions. And if you're managing a party and you have people doing things that go against those convictions, the inclination of a politician is to rid themselves of those people. So while the the way or the historical precedent of it may not have been good because of Winnie's contribution to the struggle, I certainly understand the situation that Nelson might have been in. The thing about Malema, again, another very, he's a complicated character and a man who tells a lot of truth, but he reminds me sometimes of a doctor who is able to diagnose your illness, but the prescription may put you in the grave. The thing about the Winnie's position is that you need, after the victory, you need, while even before the victory or whatever that looks like, you need some sort of objective, of plan to say this is how we're going to live and exist after, right? So I'm very sympathetic to the idea that her position was a difficult one, because she's not somebody who really thinks about what next, or at least in my understanding of what her ideas were. But at the same time, I'm suspicious of the people who are saying that her position is not sustainable, because these are some of the same intellectuals who were saying that they did not support the struggle. Right. So what if you're saying that her position isn't sustainable and they don't support the struggle? What they're basically doing is saying that, without saying it, that they agree with the status quo. The choice, or sometimes the false choice, between appeasement and violence remind me so much of the civil rights struggle in the US, where the people with conservative politics will tell you how wonderful Dr. King was, and they don't tell you, they don't reference the fact that he also ended up murdered, like the person who they attempt to paint as his antithesis, which is obviously Malcolm. The is a difficult one, Keisha. I'm not sure that I have any real I don't have any real sense of saying it should be this way or it shouldn't be that way. All I can do is see the contradictions, and of course, we're sitting here without the fog of war many years after, and in a country where we didn't have that kind of racial brutalization. We have our own to deal with.
No, I totally see where you're coming from. I can only imagine, and thanks for reminding us that we are doing an armchair revision, because imagine that kind of brutality happening in Jamaica for decades. People do get weary of war, no matter how
But
just
Kish,
the
I don't
war
know if
is.
you probably know that many years a few
Go ahead.
right. You probably know that a few years ago I went to South Africa, and I went into the apartheid museum, and I've never had an experience that affected me in that way. I ended up canceling the part of the tour where I was supposed to go to Robben Island because I was so upset. Um, and the there's a particular incident. I don't know if it's Sharpsville, or maybe I'm confusing it with what occurred in Zimbabwe. This is just too. It's just so awful that these things were so common. Where there were children were protesting the the apartheid system, and the police showed up and used machine guns and shot children, and many of them were shot in the back, right? um and then the apartheid regime had a thing of using paint to also throw on demonstrators, and particularly purple paint, and then go and search homes after, and murder people who participated in the demonstrations. When you're living in a situation like that, I don't know how you really sit and think rationally, because all you're doing is trying to survive, right? And there comes a point where people are pushed to such a limit that the cauldron, I think, as Leighton point out, right? The white South Africans, even now to this day, them have this thing about genocide, white genocide. They're I think that they were afraid of the reaction or the potential reaction to their own brutalization that they had been doing for how much years, centuries.
Yes, very true, very true. Leighton, people in battle do get weary. Um, is it possible that they were tired of fighting with Winnie, and it is fear that as much as they loved her and honored her, her methods were just not sustainable, especially when it started to involve allegations of child murder, as in the case of Stumpy?
I don't think so. I think that I think that Michael, as you said, it's armchair revisionism. But if people are going to come to the table, to call you to the table to discuss the terms on which you will be given your freedom, after having you in prison for 27 years, then that means all the cards are in your favor. And who capitulates when all the cards are in their favor? Just doesn't make sense. That's one. Two, all the narratives of unsustainability, as they rightly mentions, are from the West. People who had a vested interest in keeping South Africa exactly the way it is. No. While saying that apartheid is no longer and South Africa is free. So, um, so I don't think it was unachievable. I think, but for Nelson's martyrdom, and I put that in quotes because obviously he was a living martyr. The people that followed Winnie, full stop.
Speaking of which, to what extent was the release of Mandela by the apartheid regime their ultimate chess move against Winnie? Because Winnie essentially took the place of Mandela whilst he was safely tucked away, so to speak. So the win that they thought they gained by locking up Nelson Mandela was completely turned on its head by Winnie's activism in the streets. And it seems to me, and you can tell me if you agree or not, Ashley, but it appears to me that the only way for them to quell the revolution being pushed by Winnie is to release Nelson. And in that way, they can say, hey, look, apartheid is over. Here is your real warrior. Here is your real representative. Here is your real leader. We have freed him and yet we have made him president. No need to follow that mad woman anymore. It's almost as though the freeing of Nelson Mandela was the only thing that could calm Winnie's fire down. What are your thoughts, Ashley?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, Keisha. The thing about it, right? Um, the, I believe that the whole transition was orchestrated between some powerful people in the ANC, including Mandela and the apartheid regime. If it wasn't Mandela, it would have been somebody else. And the one of the things that I always think about is how institutionalized people's positions are individuals. And I think John Henry is one of the scholars that always mention this. And he says, you know, whenever there's a when the dominant society
You seem
is
to be
that
breaking up.
it's breaking up.
It was breaking
Kish,
up just now,
at
but
this,
it's
you hearing me now?
yes, I'm hearing you now.
Yeah, I don't know. My internet connection is not very good, so apologies. The, what I was basically saying is that in some ways, what occurred in the transition was bigger than Nelson or Winnie. I think that the groups of people on both sides, the anti-apartheid and the pro-apartheid, got together and they said, if we're going to do this transition in a non-violent way or relatively non-violent, this is what we're going to do. And so in some ways, it was not even about Winnie, it was about what she represented, and it was about the 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 position that there should be a violent overthrow of the regime as opposed to a negotiated transition, right? So is a more radical position and a less radical one. And I think about it so many times because again, it's a trick that that um that those groups play, right? And the very same had more aggressive challenges to Jim Crow were not being undertaken in the US, you would have never gotten civil rights legislation when it did. But the government there said if we don't do this, the potential outcome is mass riots in the street, right? And we don't want that. So to prevent an uprising, this is what we're gonna do.
Whoa. You know, when I think of the transitionary offer that Nelson must have received from the apartheid government, I can't help but to compare in some way that of the deception of Fidel Castro. Is it too much to ask, or is it too far fetched to think that Nelson could have made his own chess move in that? Yes, man, white man. Yes, apartheid. Yeah, man. Yeah, man, just free me. And when you free me, me come out and everybody going to be part of the rainbow. And then once in power, he betrays them. Why is that so much to ask? Nelson was a brilliant attorney, a brilliant political activist. He had 27 years behind bars to plot, to think, to examine, to analyze. Castro did something similar. Is it too much to ask? Is it a flight of fancy that I'm going on? Leighton, what are your thoughts? And then I want to come to you, K. Dot.
I am a fight aficionado. Boxing, kickboxing, mixed martial arts. And one of the aspects of all great fighters is the finish. Um, because you'll have a good fighter. He's good in the opening, he's good in the fight. But when it comes to the end game, he can't finish the fight. And when you say, is it too much to ask? It definitely is not. It's one thing to not fight when the chips are down and you're throwing a lifeline or a compromise on you. But when you know that your opponent is weak, to negotiate terms as though you're on equal footing with people who shoot school children in the back. No.
K. Dot, what's your comments on that?
Alright, alright. Greetings, everybody. Well, I I understand the plight of Leighton a while ago, and I am with that. I am with that. The revolution lost its revolution somewhat. Um, you. I don't know what else could have been done, but part of the problem is what we have with us is succession planning. I think Nelson did what he could do, and he adjusted based on what the time he spent on Roaring Island. And we lost that revolutionary, that man that set the bombs and all them thing there when he before he went to Robin Island. But who was there? Winnie alone couldn't do it. But what happened after he went into prison? Who was there to carry on the fight, to carry on the revolution? Yeah, that is part of the
Winnie.
issue.
Winnie was there.
Winnie was there, yes, but Winnie Winnie got betrayed somewhat by her own very own people. So the revolution, it almost like it caving on itself somehow. Because as I questioned before, who has economic control in South Africa? For me, the power is still in the hands of the whites. The media left it. Our artists who sang against apartheid and all those things left it. When we shouldn't even leave it. So, that's what we're there. That's what me there.
People left the fight because of the symbolic win, the shambolic win
Ah,
of
ah,
having President Nelson Mandela, the head of
ah,
South Africa. What
ah.
else is there to fight for? What else is there to fight for? A man
Mm,
who was once rebelling against the apartheid regime now sits in the highest seat of power,
yeah.
notwithstanding the economic divide.
So we
And
got
and
seduced.
so there is nothing to fight for.
Right. So we got seduced by the symbolism.
Not we, Nelson. Um,
Exactly.
you were saying, Leighton. Go
Yes.
ahead, Leighton.
Exactly. Same Obamaism, same Kamalaism, same Meghan Markleism. Just want a black person on the throne to say that we have overcome. Which is why, again, I mentioned that Malema call him thing economic freedom fighters. And at first, when I saw the name of the thing, I said, why on earth did he do that? I mean, have you ever seen a political party call itself economic anything? Economic freedom fighters. And he called it that, or whatever formation he was with, decided on that name because they wanted to stress that there must be economic um, benefit within their lifetimes for the black people of South Africa. And he realized that the form of freedom, quote unquote, that was given along with the release of Mandela was a three card trick. So he might defend economic freedom. And that also allowed him to target black people who were um, keeping the masses of the people from economic freedom in cahoots with the white supremacists that they had taken over from.
You know, Ashley, as a Jamaican, obviously I don't have actual experience with apartheid regime in the same way as South Africans do. But I do have a very visceral, emotional reaction that is similar to how I feel about hearing the Maroon Treaty that was signed with the British. And it almost feels like Nelson Mandela signed an apartheid treaty, knowing fully well that one of the terms was that he had to catch Winnie and return her into exile. Is that a fair comparison?
No. Um, the when they, you know, boy, the Maroons. I don't even know if this is a safe space. And I can't say what I actually think about the Maroons. But I think
Well,
that they,
I will caution you that the the conversations are being recorded and will
yeah,
be later uploaded to YouTube.
yeah. So
However, it's faceless. So
I would just use that as my inference
yes, yes,
and
sir.
said
Yes, sir.
and said that I think that the role of the Maroons in our history was more pernicious than what um than what Mandela did. Mandela was an idealist, maybe a misunder not misunderstood. I think maybe he misunderstood the situation because of his idealism, and he made a choice that that in his mind, let us work along with the system and see what happens. The Maroons, when they did what they did, were active agents of, well, maybe more, I would say, more aggressive agents, more pernicious agents in the support of slavery. So I don't, if we, but I suppose that's one view. Maybe you could say that is a degree of separation. But then there's another view that say that maybe both of them are negative influences. But I don't get the same visceral reaction to Mandela despite his mistakes and his flaws as I do with the Maroons. That's just my view.
Leighton.
It's so interesting that you use the word visceral because I was actually listening to one of the politics watch episodes, the latest one today, where Sir P was talking about the Maroon Treaty, and of course I knew about the Truth Gangsters topic this evening, and I felt the same visceral thing, like the man signed a Maroon Treaty. Because listen, here's what people are not understanding, and this is one of the reasons it's so difficult for me to have conversations with anybody. Because at the time, nobody was talking about it. Why did they do it? Every I saw extensive clips of the clerk talking about why he did it, and it was so airy fairy and like wishy washy, and no, you guys are hiding something. They knew something was about to go down that they could not stop. Let me tell you what really, 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 you know how South Africa was a nuclear power when the whites were in power? You know that South Africa is not a nuclear power anymore? Part of the agreement for Nelson to come to power was for them to give away all of them nuclear armaments. David Cameron, father or grandfather was the one that brokered that deal, former British Prime Minister. So it's a complete sellout.
And I tell you one of the reasons why I say that, Ashley. The what is it? The Truth Reconciliation Forum, the opportunity that was passed up to criminally hold accountable the people who, as Leighton said, were shooting children in their backs, that were torturing pregnant women. Nelson had to have agreed beforehand that in order for him to be released, no senior apartheid member, conspirator would have been held criminally liable. But Winnie was convicted for the death of Stumpy. Winnie was fired from her post by Nelson Mandela. Meanwhile, he was accepting peace prizes with de Klerk. I just can't help but feel the same way. Like Nelson was like a maroon slave catcher, signing away the rights of Winnie, the ANC, and the people who followed her. But I concede that perhaps my judgment may be a little bit harsh. So I'll move on. I want to talk about
Sorry,
Winnie.
Kish,
Sorry, yes. Yes,
yeah,
yes, no, please.
not to belabor this point too
No, no,
much.
no, please go
I
ahead. It's an
suppose,
important
I
point.
suppose, yeah, I suppose one of the things that I would say is a distinction, and again, is about degrees. And then some people say the degrees don't matter, and I'm also sympathetic to that view. The Mandela was making decisions under duress, right? When the Maroons made their agreements, they had been beating the British in war for a while, right? The history of the Maroons is an interesting one because they were landing consistent blows on redcoats long before their enemies in Europe. And so the same degree of duress that Mandela felt when he was making his decisions, the Maroons were not operating under the similar circumstances. And even when the Maroon settlements became more entrenched, they began to to they continued the agreement when they really didn't have to, right? And one of the things that, if you're going to history, will tell you that, and look at it, which you don't talk about because it aggravates community tensions, as the British would say, is there's a disdain for the people who are not Maroons, the Africans, that I just don't think Mandela and the people who made the deal had. And so if I'm to think about the psychology of the decision making and how the groups acted, I would say that is why I don't have the same reaction to Mandela, despite his mistakes and his over optimism about his position.
Well, two things. One, yes, I agree that they weren't under the same level of duress, but I think Leighton raised an important point in that there was a similar impasse in the war where they felt defeated enough, perhaps not as defeated as the Maroons were with the British or the British were with the Maroons, but they felt defeated enough that they had to present him with a compromise. That's one. And
Hmm.
two, I can see if we look at psychology as you mentioned and how these negotiations work, the psychology behind torture, the psychology behind negotiations generally. We know the history of Nelson. He was an arrogant man. His wife had superseded him in stature and importance in some ways. And I can just see those Afrikaners or whatever they call themselves. Hey, look, you're going to die here withered and a forgotten old man. Look at your wife. She's cheating. She have man left, right, and center. She's making a fool of you. You're a cuckold. Come, we can restore you to your former glory and more. But we need you to distance yourself from this woman. We need you to symbolically catch her and return her to us, along with her followers. Sorry, Leighton, you've removed your mic. You wanted to respond?
Yes, Keith. Let me tell you what I appreciate the distinctions Ashley makes. between Mandela's situation and the Maroon situation. Viscerally, why it feels to me like the same situation is the position both were in when the oppressor came to seek the treaty. Because not them said to the oppressor, listen, we're under fire, yes, sir, you know. Remember, you know, that's a big part of the longer Mandela was in prison, the more chips he had, you know. If you remember, you know, the apartheid regime was deathly afraid that he would die in prison. They knew that if he ever died in prison, they couldn't contain the situation. That's part of the reason that they killed a few birds with one stone in releasing him. Try and remember, anytime he had medical episodes, he was not treated on Robben Island. He was removed to a hospital where everybody know what's going on. They couldn't afford for him to die there. All of the chips were with him. They were calling him in. Everything he agreed to, he agreed to. And that's why I say, it remind me I'm Maroon then.
I want to talk about Winnie's time in um, Bradford. I believe the section of South Africa is called, where she was placed in exile far away from her home. She was really banished. She wasn't allowed much visitation, if any, and she was banished there for 9 years. And the the idea of I'm raising this specifically in relation to the allegations levied against her that her brand of revolution was just scorched earth, because I think her time spent in Bradford really challenges this perception, because we see where she really comes to life as a grassroots organizer. She went in unknown, completely isolated from her family, cut off, banned from moving, and she managed to organize the people of that community. We know she was a brilliant social worker. She started to organize the sick, the elderly, help them with educating the children. How important is that part of Winnie in her version of revolution? Leighton, you wanted to comment, and then Ashley, you can jump in.
It's it's crucial because that kind of activism, just the kitchen gardens, the food programs, elderly check-ins, health clinics. Remember, this was a place that was Brantford was away. It was like a different South Africa, one of the most conservative regions. The blacks in that part of the country never give no trouble at all. And after Winnie did a little time, the people them, white people them, start petition the authorities to move her to exile some other part of the country. Because the black people them start on uncontrollable. No. Just try and imagine she get black people to start on uncontrollable just by her community activism. No firebrand speechifying, just by her movements, just by her organization, just by her influence. She was able to radicalize a completely a completely subjugated population. And I think that is a real tribute to her phenomenal skills of organization and leadership.
Ashley, could this be said as to one of the reasons why Winnie was so feared? Was that um, she was so loved because she was really a woman of the people. She was in the trenches with them. What are your thoughts on this aspect of Winnie's leadership?
They One of the things throughout history. So the first thing is that I didn't know that about her, so I learned that, and I also realized that I have to is an episode that I need to go back again and do some different readings on. The Jomo Kenyatta, I think, said that if you ever see certain groups praising me, know that I have betrayed my brothers. And so, if it is that we're looking at the portrayal of Winnie as a mad woman, as a hyper violent masculine woman, as an uncontrollable woman, and and we look at the places where that narrative is coming from, I put no credence in it. And I'm open to the idea that we don't even know maybe half the history of what she did. The thing about tyranny, especially racial tyranny, tyrants are afraid of competent people, and they are afraid of capable people in the guise of the people that they're trying to oppress. And there's this book called Propaganda. Right, it's not so much a racial element to it, but it tells you about the ways in which tyrants manage messages. And one of the things that they tell you is that if you have an opponent who is capable, you must find ways of you can't kill them because that will make them a martyr, right? You must find ways of denigrating, debasing, and marginalizing their contribution and their presence so as to break the faith of their people in them. And that is exactly the betrayal that was that was often propagated about Winnie.
Wow, I absolutely love that, Ashley. Thank you for that quote from Kenyatta. I didn't even know he said that. But you mentioned one of the ways in which Winnie is demonized is, representing her as a mad woman and as someone very masculine and overly aggressive. And it's funny because last week we discussed a bit of that in the podcast on what the modern woman represents. And I often think Winnie, someone who is very confident, very forthright, very assertive, borderline aggressive, would be criticized in modern day lingo as being a masculine woman. And I find it interesting because to me, Winnie exemplifies femininity. And she stands as such a physical contradiction to all the tropes of black femininity floating around now. She never so much of her most fiery speeches were given in dresses, were given in her cute little lipsticks and head wraps. And tried as they may to masculinize her, it was never successful. What are your thoughts on that, Leighton? How would we in these times view a Winnie?
I think that's a great point that you make, and it's something that has always fascinated me about her. Of all the world leader women I've ever seen, she was the most, if not the only, feminine one. Completely feminine. almost flirtatious, and feminine, of course, in her mannerisms, even in her, and this is a big part of the problem I have with how we discuss masculine and feminine, because most this modern concept of femininity is of masculine strong, feminine weak, masculine aggressive, feminine submissive. And so, by that definition, any woman who is assertive is unfeminine. Now, when you consider, I mean, I don't mean to shift the conversation, but when you consider manosphere tropes, that's kind of wild because, according to the manosphere, it's for the woman to resist a man's advances. And a good woman will resist a man's advances. They're looking for good feminine women. Now, they knowing men and knowing how men make their advances, how would they expect any woman to resist a man's advances without being assertive? So, you know, of course, they want an assertive woman dealing with the helper. They want an assertive woman dealing with the bill collector. They, but assertiveness is somehow masculine. So anyway, the just looking at Winnie's mannerisms, her carriage, it's a woman that I would check. It's not like a Margaret Thatcher type, a Mia Mottley type. You name the kind of woman that moves like a man, Angela Merkel type, and has to be this way because she has to stand shoulder to shoulder with the men. And therefore, no, 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 no. Winnie was just in a class by herself, and she was a perfectly, not just feminine, but like extremely attractive woman.
Absolutely, I agree. Ashley, Winnie certainly wasn't quote unquote resting in her femininity. Where would South Africa's revolution be if Winnie opted for demure and cutesy instead of stepping up to the fight?
The funny thing is, I don't know that she wasn't demure, right? In her personal, one of the things that surprised me, I was making a comment in the chat that they never show her in certain ways in the media. They When I was going through the museums, both the apartheid one and the other one on Constitutional Hill, what they have is some old videos and also some old pictures. And I was amazed by the images that I was seeing, because I was like, I could not, understand why is it that they don't show these. One of the museum directors, or the tour director, is black, and again, she's a black, she's black and she's Zulu. So she's like, you don't remember that images, right? Most people are that when they meet the person, they're meeting them through images. They don't meet them as the actual person, right? And then she pointed out that a lot of the photographs that were taken, They were taken just like the ones of Dr. King. They were actually taken in color, and then they were made into black and white very deliberately, right? And the ones that you could see in color, Winnie had these big earrings. She had on lipstick, right? The waist was snatched, and I was just blown away by what I was seeing, right? So in your personal deportment, or even how you carry yourself, that's one thing, but your politics is something else. I often think that sometimes, especially in the West, as a result of patriarchy, the patriarchs don't want you to separate the two, right? And so you either, and it's a system of control, obviously. You either is a binary, and a binary of control.
Wow, I would have loved to see those pictures, Ashley. We have to do a trip to South Africa together one of these days.
Absolutely.
K dot. It would appear that one of the things that Winnie's imagery does is to confirm that African femininity is not the same as Western femininity. Being feminine as an African woman doesn't mean you're a damsel in distress that faints at every sight of discomfort. It also doesn't mean that you are a quote unquote strong black woman, workhorse, Barbara the Builder, that just look rough and scruffy. Winnie proves those two stereotypes wrong. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I agree. I do agree. I do agree. Based on what Asi said just now, they had to find a way to paint that type of Western woman by adjusting her images and all of that. Because they was not getting the Winnie that they want to perceive to the rest of the world in their own way. You know? So Asi said it all pretty much. You know?
Thank you for that, K. Dot. Leighton, we see it with women like Amy Ashwood, Amy Jakes, um, Malcolm X's wife, all of these women. It seems as though the title of wife seems to water down the role of a revolutionary woman. And sometimes I wonder, would Winnie have been able, or would she be remembered in a greater light or a more accurate light if she wasn't constantly being relegated to the shadow of Nelson Mandela? What are your thoughts on that?
Definitely, that would have been so, I think, because to be honest with you, there is so much that um in the documentaries, couple documentaries that I watched in anticipation of the show, um, I didn't know, and of course you don't know it. Okay, so the thing that I found out today or yesterday rather for the first time was that she wasn't introduced to politics by him. I had no clue. In fact, to his credit, I guess in a sense, and perhaps in his ignorance in another, he did his best to insulate her or protect her from his activities, such that when she would go to even meet him, she would be blindfolded. so she could be interrogated as to, you know, which is was for both their safety, really, to protect him, because you don't know what, you know, interrogative measures they might use, and for the interrogators, hopefully at an early stage, to be able to say that she really don't know nothing. So all her activism was like outside of him, and you know, when he was in prison, and in the same way before he went to prison, like he was the name that they called. He was the embodiment of the movement. That she felt the weight of that. And she doesn't even describe it as a weight, but that she felt the significance of that enough to embody the movement in his stead. And it's funny that no what ifs are ever contemplated about if they had joined forces upon his release, and you know, work together for the ideals that they suffered for.
Actually, I don't know if you're aware, but Winnie recounts that on her wedding day, her father told her that she was not marrying Nelson Mandela. She was getting married to the struggle because he was such a prominent freedom fighter in the ANC. He told her point blank, "You are getting married to the struggle." And it's very clear that at some point her first allegiance was to the struggle. But at the same time, there is talk that part of the divide between Nelson and her had to do with her infidelity whilst he was locked away. Is that an unreasonable position from a husband now? Forget Nelson, the political activist. Is it not reasonable for him to feel betrayed in that sense? That here is my wife who I expect to hold me down, so to speak, having these relations allegedly or otherwise with other men. Is that a fair feeling for a husband locked away to have?
Well, that's a tough one, Keisha. They, you know, while laughing. No, let me give you a real life story. Is a quick one. I was,
Ashley, in
they,
plain terms,
a,
she give her the thing.
a,
What the man for do?
a, a friend of mine was counseling another friend because of a similar situation, and the friend said to him that him judging the girlfriend too harshly, and a lot of things happened, and was basically saying that him should consider not breaking up the marriage. And the friend who is the subject of the infidelity say, plenty people around the table get born is, but it's because a lot of people don't know, so they're able to take a different view on it, right? And I'm just thinking, they in normal everyday life, people have their fragilities, and the fragilities of men and women are maybe different, but the weight of public scrutiny is not on us as it would have been on them. And the fact of the infidelity was also something that was used against Mandela by the apartheid government. So I don't know what that may have done to his psyche, and also the fact the is like all these little things being piled on each other. So you had that episode, not to mention the fact that in his day Mandela himself was not a saint in terms of his relationships. That's another element that was also used against both of them. And that's another story. But and then once you get out, you not only find that you get bun, but you find out that the person who will give you bun, your partner, say, well, you do a fuckery. I think at some point the straw must break, the camel back must break.
I mean, Leighton actually raised a fair point. How much confidence could Mandela Nelson inspire in his soldiers if he's a cuckold? Would that not weigh on his credibility as a man, as a leader? Not even you can't even control your wife. You want to come control we? What are your thoughts?
Um, how long was he in prison?
27 years.
Oh, okay. Well, listen. Let me tell you a story. Briefly. I was speaking to a friend of mine. He's a little older than me, but he's telling me when he was a young fella, 18, 19, and he used to hang around older men. And there were two of the older men. It was a group of them. He was really close to, kind of like a godfather, and these were kind of pirates of his godfather. And they all liked him, respected him. He would run errands for them, earn money, and so forth. And he said that he used to have sex with two of the men's wives. They were older men and with younger wives. And they knew that they were unable to satisfy their wives, and they came to him and they would pay him to satisfy their wives. They preferred for her not to sneak around, run around. They would prefer to have somebody that they, you know, knew and respected to do that. Which is, a real big man thing, looking out for your wife. Now, if I were in prison for life, because he didn't know that. Remember, it was for life. Regardless, that with each illness and what have you, so there was talk of them releasing him. There was talk of his sentence. I was living in the time. Could it happen? Would it happen? Might it happen? But at the end of the day, like after how many years would you, as a sensible man, send a message to your wife and say, babes, say, I don't know, say it hard, and and just not go on too bad. Cause remember, say, you're the mother of the nation. And I never hear nobody say that Winnie behavior was scandalous. From me hear Jamaican man out the road say, boy, car. I used to hear talk on road all the time, yo, you feel say Winnie give big man bun. And man look and say, boy, Jenna, 27 year. you know, like, and they weren't saying it like, boy, she should have hold out. I mean, come on, man, people is humans. And Nelson himself, to be honest with you, Nelson just had to make it look like infidelity. Cause for the political purpose where him did need for put her one side, that would there was too much sentiment with her. You see? So him just have to make it look like say she violated as a wife and rated and put her one side. So the people that would have followed her politically, them just say, boy, them can't get really in a man and woman argument and they can't this a big man. Especially when you look at the number of years between them, to expect that, you know, how much martyrdom you can expect from one smarty.
Yeah, it seemed really unrealistic. And Ashley raised, well, he hinted at it. Winnie was Nelson's mistress when they met. He was married with 3 or 4 children, I believe, and Winnie was his mistress, and she was 22 and he was 40. Good grief, man.
When
But
Mandela, when that whole episode was going on, Winnie was one of his mistresses.
wow, she was one of his mistresses. I also hear that his ex-wife has told stories of him being very physically abusive, and Winnie herself has described him as being very arrogant, very commanding. I don't know. But I raise that only to say that, as ridiculous as it may sound to us, given the personality type that Nelson seemed to have, it may very well have been a factor in him growing apart from Winnie. Not to say that there was not some treachery and political motive behind it, but I do think that it was easier for him to cut her off because of his arrogance.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it was one thing that led to the relationship dissolving. I think it was a lot of different things, and there were people also pushing for the relationship to break, both within the ANC and outside in the apartheid regime.
Wow. We could go on and on talking about Mama Winnie, but we're coming up to the time to end our discussion, or at least end for now. So I would just love to hear any closing comments, thoughts. What is the best way in which we should remember Mama Winnie, and how can we preserve her legacy in this time? Leighton, you want to go first?
Yes. As you were speaking, it occurred to me that it's quite possible that Nelson didn't really know the strength of the woman that he married. Because I had always imagined that, you know, in his first wife really resented his political involvement. And so I imagine that he had married Winnie because, she was his political sidekick, and, you know, but only to find out that no, he kept his political work completely separate from her. He just asked her to raise funds for, you know, like, because he saw how good she was with social work and so forth. He just asked her to be a fundraiser. That was it. And it's possible that to some extent he could have resented the icon that she became. But as for what we can take away from her life, well, what I take away is that um, she wasn't interested in political life. She was simply a social worker trying to do her best for people that she identified with, and that she became politically involved because she realized that she couldn't change their socio-economic conditions individual by individual. It was a systemic problem, and that you had to kind of control the levers of society to be able to do it. And I think if you listen to her speak, the power of her expression comes from its simplicity and straight heartfeltness. It comes across in her interviews. She was so direct and yet gracious and soft spoken. but with complete and absolute resolve. And I think if to keep her spirit alive, people just have to live their conscience to the best of their ability. I think that was her exemplification.
Ashe, Ashe. K Dot, how do we remember Mama? What are the lessons from her life?
Well, the primary thing for me, being a woman as part of revolution in that time, that she pretty much successfully, in terms of being an example to other young girls, that you can participate fully and heavily in a cause for justice without losing feminine grace. She did that successfully, right? Um, you can be a part of a revolution for justice without being expected to just be there serving tea and donuts. Yeah. So those are the things that is why I want to remember. A revolutionary who never lost her feminine grace. Yeah.
Thank you for that, K Dot. Ashley,
Uh,
what are your final thoughts for us?
So the one of the things that struck me when you put this up is that for a long time, as you said in the opening, Whitney had been seen as the peripheral, is the wife of, and the it challenged me personally because my understanding of the history is limited to a few areas. Um, but one of the things that I absolutely know, and I think is a lesson that we must always be mindful of, is to be careful of the people that are doing the demonizing. When you have a figure that stands up to powerful oppressive forces, you must always ask yourself why certain other forces are so against them, right? And so the people that are putting out these negative, the propaganda, the news stories, the hounding, are not your friends, and they can never be your friends. And you must always challenge yourself to question their motives and learn more about the history. One of the things, Keisha, that I wanted to ask, every week you have the podcast, and sometimes some excellent reference materials are used either in your opening or are referenced by other guests. And I was wondering if there's a Truth Gangsters book list that we can go on after and learn more. I'll close there.
Wow, that was beautiful, Ashley. And thank you for that suggestion. There is not currently a book list, but I think that's a brilliant idea. I'm going to put together not just a book list, but some article references, so that we can all have access to. And I also invite everyone to make their submissions as well, so that it's not just a place of discussion, but a place of constant learning and evolution. Thanks, everyone. See you next week, same time, same place, on the Truth Gangsters podcast. Have a good evening, everyone.